Thanks for joining us for this archive of Teaching American History's Saturday webinar for 7 November 2020. Today's program was the fourth in our 5-episode series on enduring American questions, and today's question was, how did the founders differ from the progressives? Dr. Chris Burkett, professor of political science at Ashland University, was our moderator, and he was joined by Dr. David Tucker and Dr. Jason Jividen in discussing this question. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning and welcome to another teachingamericanhistory.org Saturday webinar, sponsored by the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. TAH.org is the leading online resource for the documents-based study of American history, government, and civics for teachers, students, and citizens. I'm Chris Burkett, professor of political science and history and director of the Ashbrook Scholar Program for undergraduates at Ashland University. If you've joined us before, you know that the theme of our webinars this fall is Enduring Questions About America. If you're joining us for the first time, let me mention that the point of these webinars is to pull together some thoughtful scholars and to have a conversation about important questions. And we encourage all of you to join us today in that conversation by submitting questions via the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of the screen. And we will, as always, try to get to as many of those questions as possible. In the next week, you will receive an email with a link to request a certificate of participation, as well as the link to the archived video and audio from today's program. Today, we're thinking about this question: how did the progressives differ from the founders? And to help us think about this, I'm happy to welcome Jason Jividen of St. Vincent College and David Tucker, Senior Fellow at Ashbrook. Thank you both very much for being here this morning.
Morning.
So,
Chris.
this is I think it's going to be a fun topic. It's a tough question, though, in a certain sense, because it's complicated on a number of levels. One, it's hard to pin down what a progressive is. And even among the people we think of as progressives from a certain historical period, differed among themselves over who a progressive or what made someone a progressive. And then I think this question is complicated even further by two other things. One is that the founders, the people we think of as American founders, often use language that suggested they were progressives in a certain sense. And then the progressives of the progressive era, as we think of it, often adopted the language of those American founders and appropriated the founders in a certain sense by proclaiming themselves to be the heirs of the American founding. So I'm throwing out the difficulty of the topic first here in the hopes that both of you will help us show us a way to start to think about this question. So I'll defer to either of you who'd like to help us begin.
David, you want to kick it off? I can go ahead.
Sure. One thing I would like to say to begin with is that I think I agree with what Chris just said, but I also think that when we talk about the founders, we can assume that they all agreed, and I think, again, there are ways in which they did all agree, but there's also, I think, there are also significant differences among them. And that's part of, again, what complicates the question. So some of the readings, we could have done a lot more. Even the people who were closest, Jefferson and Madison, had serious disagreements. Even I would go so far as to say over the character of what the founding was, what it represented in a way. And Jefferson, I think, thinking more like the way the progressives came to think about it, Madison thinking more like the other founders. And the difference there is how much authority should the founding actually have? Why do we, in fact, we're asked this question, the progressives and the founders, why do we still care about the founders? And Madison's had a different, in fact, Jefferson would sort of scratch his head and say, hey, 20 years have gone by. Why are you guys still talking about 1776? In a way, he would say that, perhaps. Whereas Madison would say, no, there's something about the founding that's significant and irreplaceable. Just to reinforce Chris's point, I think there are disagreements among the founders on certain issues, and that is partly what's reflected in the debate among the progressives. And I think one of those has to do with property, for example. The other has to do with, you might say, the sanctity of the Constitution, how important that is. So I don't know, Jason, if you want to comment on any of that.
No, I agree with everything that's been said. There's a difficulty in sort of lumping the founders together, just as there is lumping the progressives together. I guess one question I would ask, or sort of position I would take, is sometimes, though, on some issues, the things that they might have in common might be more fundamental than some of the differences, in the sense of talking somehow about the founding of things upon which they did agree. There are some bread and butter things it seems to me they would agree on. Primacy of sort of first principles of the Declaration, notion of natural rights, or really social contract theory. Madison and Jefferson disagree as to the margins of how we think about that and how it would work in practice, but there's some theoretical agreements that are there that I think will help maybe distinguish them from the progressives. Taking in all of the diversity of thought, I think with the progressives there might be some things that help hold a pretty disparate movement together. I think Chris is exactly right. You've got populist reformers, you've got suffragists, you've got temperance advocates, you've got sort of German-trained PhD political theorists. I mean, they're all over the map, and they come together loosely to what we call this progressive movement. But if you're really being intellectually honest, they're all over the place. So we have to wonder, what are some things that they might have in common that are more fundamental than some of those differences? And I do think the progressives see themselves as trying to take another look at, if not, some folks would say rejecting, that might be true of some, but others would say reevaluating and thinking how to navigate the principles and institutions of the founding in changed circumstances, right? Especially changed economic circumstances. And so at the very least, I think there's a pretty broad effort among progressives to rethink what we're doing in terms of the principles of the founding in a new sort of uncharted course. So despite all the differences, I think there's some pretty fundamental similarities, and that helps us make comparisons between the two.
I would just like to follow up and say, correct myself. I don't think Jefferson ever would have said, "Why are you talking about the Declaration?" I meant really to say, "Why are you talking about the founding or the Constitution?" I mean, I think he always held fast to that notion of equality, and I think that's in some of the reading for today. I think even that notion is the notion of equality is different in a way, at least with some of the progressives. But I wondered what you would think of this. In thinking about this question, it seemed to me one way in which there's continuity is in the way the way Jefferson and the Democratic Party, or the Democratic Party tradition after him, thought about corporations, and the way that the progressives tended to think. And I acknowledge that there are differences even there, but tended to think about corporations.
Yeah.
And just to extend that a little bit, would you say that, for example, the term faction, the way it's used in the Federalist Papers, is equivalent to the term special interest in the way that's used in the progressives? Yeah. Or do you, even in those cases, would you see differences? I mean,
I think there's some differences. I think some differences in the latter more than the former. I'm not enough of a scholar on Jefferson, Madison, corporations, other than to say I think Wilson, in some ways, when he appeals to this Jeffersonian strain, is right to say that insofar as we're talking about trying to maintain competition and individual equality of opportunity, and insofar as corporate arrangements can be made to frustrate that, then I think there's a kinship there of trying to, and I think it comes across even in some of the readings we saw today from Jefferson on the unequal distribution of property, which Madison himself would speak about in Federalist 10, and talking about faction. But I often, with my students, get right at this question of thinking about, would say a Madison have understood faction the same way that, say, a TR in the New Nationalism speech would understand something like special interest? I'm not always convinced they're the same. Sometimes they might be the same. I think it's very much going to depend on circumstances, because as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, for Madison, faction is necessarily a bad thing, even if we have to use it to our advantage, because it's always adverse to one of two good things, either the rights of other citizens or to the common good. And it's not clear to me that all interests are necessarily adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the common good. Now, maybe by putting the phrase special in front of it, I don't know, maybe we can magically turn it into something else. But insofar as folks like TR say, we're going to drive special interests out of politics if it doesn't actively serve the common good, that seems to be something, taking a leap further than what Federalist 10 does. Federalist 10 says we'll have to tolerate it because it's sown in the nature of man, and so therefore we'll try to use this vice and somehow make public virtue out of it. And maybe that's debatable, but I do think there's, depending on the circumstances, there's a difference. I joke with my students with stupid examples. I'll often say, I can think of lots of interest groups that might very well be pretty unobjectionable, like the National Association of Puppies and Grandmas or something like that. They don't all have to be factious. And so sometimes I hesitate a bit to sort of equate the notion of special interest as the progressives talk about it with faction, unqualifiedly.
Yeah. Well, it does seem to me that you're right when you say special interest, that means it's something opposed to the common good, so to speak.
Yeah.
Maybe not always, but that seems to be the intent.
Yeah.
And I also think you're right. I mean, obviously, in the 10th Federalist, factions are part of the political process, and that's how you control them. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me in the progressives, there's more a sense of there has to be, I don't know if it goes so far as to say, as Madison would say, a will independent of society to control special interests, but they need to be regulated by the government. Somehow the political process can't handle them anymore. Whereas it seems clear in the case, I think you're right, it seems clear in the case of the founding that, I know, in fact, you can't get rid of them, and it's a good thing because, or it can be made a good thing by bringing them into politics and bringing them into the political process and structuring things so that that's how they're managed.
You mentioned that line in Fed 51 about the idea of having a will independent of the majority to somehow be able to protect the rights of the minority against the majority. And it's interesting that, Madison's solution is to say, well, in old regimes, they would have had an aristocracy, right? And we're a Republican government. So we don't have that. So we substitute for aristocracy, multiplicity of interests and checking factions against one another and all of that. But, I'm not ready to own this statement, but I've heard some folks sometimes argue that perhaps in progressivism, part of introducing that separate will would be through a more bigger centralization of, say, administration or something like that, sort of a la Woodrow Wilson, that separate will is brought in by expertise, right? Bureaucratic expertise or something like that. And again, I'd have to think about that some, but I've heard people make that argument.
No, I think that's an interesting point. So there's a kind of assumption. I mean, and this is obviously maybe too broad a generalization, but among the progressives, there's a faith in technical scientific expertise, and that has and they believe it should have a greater role in how government works. Mm-hmm. That the reading from Jefferson's account of the University of Virginia, mm-hmm. His educational plans always included picking the best students, if their parents couldn't afford to pay for their schooling, to have the best students, a small number, 10%, paid for at public expense, and then out of that group, you'd pick the best 10%, and they would go to the university and so forth. And he says, they're the ones we hope judges, lawyers, the people who will kind of exercise the executive, legal, judicial, and executive power will be in the hands of these well-educated people. So you could say, oh, well, gee, that's the same thing. But Jefferson doesn't put the emphasis on technical. One reason I think that report from Virginia is important is because he doesn't put the emphasis on technical scientific expertise. It's on, he talks about virtue and being examples of virtue to others. It's a different conception of how the educated should be part of the republic, so to speak. It seems to me. I don't know if that.
I tend to have the same reading of that piece. In fact, I hadn't read that piece for a while until I was preparing for this when we put the readings together, and I was glad that you put it in there because I was reminded of there's a real nod there to liberal education as part of, and civic education as part of the liberal education, and of course there's some maybe minorly technical things, but it's by no means what we talk about when we're talking about technocracy or bureaucratic expertise. It's a kind of notion of a certain type of the old folks would say a certain type of soul that's required for public spiritedness and public virtue and statesmanship, right? So I agree with you entirely on that piece.
Yeah. And he does there mention progress and, sort of typical. Jeffersonian language going after monkish superstition and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And that's true. And that's a very important part of Jefferson. And so either you or Chris mentioned when we first started how the founders believed in progress. So you know, that's true, but it doesn't necessarily, that progress doesn't, and the technical, Jefferson mentions this in one of the letters we read. You can look just in his, you know, looking in his lifetime, looking back 50 years, you can see the great technical progress we've made, he says. So that it doesn't exclude technical progress, and that, or that technical advance is part of what he means by progress. So I don't know if there's a, if even on the question of progress, we can make a very sharp distinction, but at least in terms of the kind of expertise that was involved, or he hoped would be involved in running the country, it seems different from what the progressives had in mind.
Yeah, I would start to maybe try to make a distinction. I don't know if I can defend it or if I can have it hold up under real scrutiny, but I'm sort of standing on the shoulders of other folks that have written on this over the years. I always think of James Caesar, always had a really nice, pithy sort of characterization of this distinction to say that Enlightenment era, sort of Jeffersonian era progress would have been seen as progress with a lowercase p, whereas progressive progress of the Wilsons and Herbert Crowleys, et cetera, would be with a capital P. And the idea was a doctrine of progress that was sort of historically faded, that wasn't rooted so much in an idea of nature that might be true everywhere and always, and we're discovering that nature better as we evolve scientifically and philosophically, but rather that the standard itself is a shifting goalpost, right? So that history itself is moving and progress is necessarily part of this sort of Hegelian dialectic, right? Whereas for Jefferson and the gang, progress is using science and reason to better understand that nature, but that nature is necessarily imperfect. We can maybe make it more perfect, but it's always going to be necessarily imperfect. And the great line in one of the readings was, I think he's following Condorcet, but the notion that progress would not be infinite, but indefinite. There's a stopping point. We don't know what that is, and nature's not revealed that to us. I think there is a kind of an overcoming maybe of those limits, at least in theory, on the part of some capital P progressive notions of progress, historical progress. And I don't know how far we can push that, but it seems to me that the appeal to nature on the one hand, and say a Jefferson or a Madison, even in their most sort of exuberant moments of Jefferson, it's an appeal to nature. Whereas I think with Wilson and Crowley and some progressives, there's really kind of turning away from that and an appeal to history. And in fact, in some of the readings, we assign, say, the Merriam piece, he captures really well the progressive mood, at least in academia, that we don't believe this natural rights stuff anymore. We don't believe this social contract stuff and this natural law stuff. And by the end of the piece, he says the average lunchbox worker might believe this, but we educated elite, we know these things aren't true anymore. So I think that's maybe the beginning of a distinction on progress. But again, I don't know if that holds any water with you, David, or not. But I'd be interested to hear what you think.
No, that makes sense to me. I was struck by Miriam saying these new ideas have not yet penetrated perhaps to the mass of Americans,
right,
who remain committed to the revolution and the Declaration and these things. And I mean, one thing I was struck, and I have to say, given the divisions that mark American politics now, there's a way in which that still seems true to me in some ways. That you see people brandishing "Give me liberty" or "Give me death" T-shirts, or wearing them. So there's a commitment among people to the revolution and that tradition still. And I don't know if I guess from the viewpoint of the people, Miriam and the people he's writing about, that proves we are, impenetrably dense and hopeless, or whether, the ideas that and I mean here, not the political ideas that might be expressed by Roosevelt or Wilson, but the academic, or if you will, theoretical ideas that were being discussed then are so I don't know if the word is apolitical or anti-political, but it's not clear to me that in in the form that they're presented in the Merriam piece that you could I mean, maybe this is a better way to talk about it. You know, Wilson obviously was an academic, and he's even mentioned in Merriam's account saying, you know, Wilson, and he's described, and he became president of the United States. So I think it's interesting to try to see, in the case of Wilson, how he tried to translate some of those things into political speech. And it doesn't, although he was, you know, obviously elected and reelected, it's not clear to me that he succeeded fundamentally in maybe the same way that Jefferson succeeded in establishing a party that really did change the character, or I don't know if I should say change the character, but I think change the direction maybe of American politics in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the first part is, you know, what's this sort of connection between, you know, the academy and the world of ideas, and, you know, the world of practice. And so many of the progressive intellectuals like Merriam, J. Allen Smith, others were not just academics, they were also tireless political activists and on the political scene. Merriam's a good example of that.
Yeah.
Office holders, you know, advisors to presidents, you know, that sort of thing. So they saw the role of the public intellectual is because combining that educated bureaucratic expertise, public administration. This is the origins of that real study, and power and political power. And I think Wilson, you know, wrote about it, reflected on it. You know, I would wonder with Wilson's impact in terms of establishing that and all of that in practice. I don't know, if we look back, it might have not have happened with Wilson himself, but the sort of blueprint that Wilson saw that progressivism might take in terms of institutions, especially, find some soil eventually. I think you don't get the New Deal and its understanding of executive authority and its relationship to administration without Wilson. I think, isn't it in 32 when FDR accepts the nomination, he says, we're just following in the footsteps of the marching orders of our captain, Woodrow Wilson, in doing and proposing all of these things. And I would also say, just, I think the way we talk about the presidency today, you know, even right now within the last few days, I mean, just the way presidents behave, the way things we expect from presidents, maybe sometimes falsely, on both sides of the ball, doesn't matter what party it is very much indebted to some of those Wilsonian academic readings, and some of which are in the readings for today.
Yeah, or in the Commonwealth Address, when that to me has always been a clear example of the influence of those ideas in the way that Roosevelt talks about rights and the changes that are going on, and government giving us rights to match the changed socioeconomic circumstances in modern America. That's the way I think none of the founders ever would have spoken.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. This notion, the very task of statesmanship is the redefinition of rights, and in light of a growing and changing social order. Right?
Yeah.
In fact, that is a just unabashedly Wilsonian passage. He's riffing on Wilson's notion that the Declaration is really about a sort of negotiation or push and pull between the people and their government, whereby the government accords you certain rights. And a student of the Declaration knows that we're talking rather about pre-political rights that the governments are founded to secure. And I think that's another good example of some of the differences, not monolithically across founding and all progressives, but among some writings we can really see a kind of progressive either redefinition of the origin of rights, and thereby probably the content and the scope of those rights, but also just, I think, in some progressives, and this maybe goes beyond the readings we did for today, but there's a kind of ambivalence in some ways about rights in general, simply because rights often imply limitations on what governments can do. If you can redefine rights in a way that associates them with government grants of entitlement or something like that, then you're a little more comfortable with it. So I think FDR takes rights language much further than many progressives themselves did, but it might be based on a kind of progressive thrust or impulse or foundation.
Right.
That's one of those examples I was mentioning earlier, where progressives seem to appropriate or adopt the language of, in this case, the social contract, right? But a careful student or observer would notice that the terms of the contract or the nature of the contract is different than the way that Jefferson and Madison and others thought about that.
Yeah.
David, you mentioned earlier, this is quite a while ago, the possibility that there's some similarities between progressives and Madison and Jefferson on corporations, when you were talking about their views on corporations. I just wanted to mention quickly, there is one other way in which I think they're similar, and maybe you were alluding to this, and that's the effect that people working, the effect that corporations have on those who work for them. in terms of the possibility for liberty and self, self-government and improvement and these things. So there does seem to be a parallel there, because we see in the language of Wilson quite often, right, in the piece on what is progress, the major problem we're dealing with is corporations. And the problem with corporations is, yes, on the surface, they're unregulated, but the effect of the unregulated nature of corporations is that they're having an effect on what Wilson calls individualism. So I wondered if Wilson's notions of individualism is somehow similar to or parallels how Jefferson and Madison, or at least Jefferson, might have thought of those things. And then I also want to use that to segue to some really good questions as well that have come in, if you don't mind, eventually.
Sure. Yeah. Chris, could I just ask you to clarify? You mean in the terms of if you're employed by a corporation, then in some sense you have lost, because you've lost control over your economic independence, so to speak, then you've lost independence generally, right?
Right. Yeah, Madison makes that argument in some essays. This is connected, as you suggested earlier, to this argument between Jefferson and the agrarian way of life as opposed to the
I think that's
working for manufacturers. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, from the viewpoint of Jefferson, that's very, very true, and that's why the only people who can really be the basis of an independent republic, or put it this way, unless independent farmers, landowners, not wealthy, not people like himself who owned large estates, but unless property ownership was widely spread among individuals, farmers, farm families who could support themselves, you couldn't really have an independent republic. And that's, I think, a lot of my own view is that a lot of what's happening in the populists and so forth is, it's clear that those circumstances are changing in America because of industrialization. And the question does arise, then what is the basis? If Jefferson was right, then what is the basis for independence in the republic if we all are employed, or most people are employed by these large corporations that therefore dominate their lives? Yeah.
It's not exactly the same argument, but you see Wilson used the idea that, individualism as it used to be understood is swallowed up when you become part of a corporation. And I just wondered if that was at least offered in the similar spirit to which Jefferson thought about these things.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be a way, I don't know what Jason thinks about this, but it seems to me that seems to be a concern that's common, at least to Jefferson and the populists and progressives.
Yeah, I think you do. I mean, if you go searching through some progressive writings, there's a phrase you often see. It's in Woodrow Wilson's book, The State, among other places. It's in Crowley's Promise of American Life. It's all across Dewey. It's a phrase that runs something like this with variations: equalization of conditions for individual self-development. So it's a mouthful, right? But we get the idea. The idea is that, and it's the same theme in the Commonwealth Club address in 32, that the ground has shifted so much that we can't rely on a nation of this kind of individualism that would come from agrarian virtue and agrarian republicanism, that we're now not tied to land but to the factory and to wage earning. And so to foster independence under new circumstances, to kind of continue the vision of the founding, or a Jeffersonian notion of the founding, you need to rethink your game plan. And so I think Chris is right to say there's this emphasis on individualism. I do wonder if sometimes, I mean, TR is good on this, it always phrases it as a kind of economic opportunity. But I think with Wilson, and especially with Dewey, and sort of that bridge into some later thinkers at the tail end of the progressive era, there's a kind of notion of just individual creativity, a kind of, I don't know what you would call it, releasing the will that's much broader than merely talking about an economic safety net or economic opportunity for work or something like that. And I think that becomes, I'd say, exploited, and I don't mean that in a nefarious sense, picked up and used later in later notions of individualism and equality and sort of progressive rhetoric. But I think in the progressive era, it's primarily economic. And so I think, it's not a crazy argument. If you're someone, there's a lot of folks that, from the point of view of the founding, want to critique the progressives, but if you're being foolish if you deny the really changed circumstances that America is in after the war. And so it's a plausible argument to listen to.
Right.
If you think about what's required for healthy citizenship. And TR is great on this. TR will say, I'm paraphrasing, but if you're too busy digging a ditch and you can't feed yourself, you can't be a good citizen, right? So before one can have political democracy, we need some notion of economic democracy. But what that means, the substance of that and the content of what economic democracy means, is very debatable. but I think at least we can understand the idea of creating good citizens.
Right.
Well, it means a shift from what progressives call the negative conception of government to a positive.
Right.
It means government needs to do more to actively promote opportunities or provide, I don't necessarily want to say means or resources, but something along those lines for people to fulfill the opportunities rather than just stay out of it.
I'd say there's a distinction, though, between, say, providing the conditions whereby one can sort of economically rise or whatever happens to be, and actually directly providing economic.
Right.
Yeah. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Creating conditions is one thing, providing goods and services maybe is something else, debatable.
And so I'm leading through these. I think we're leaning toward. Well, there's a question from Jeff that may point us in a certain direction here. A couple of questions from Jeff. I'll combine them. Did the progressives want to change the notion of property rights to add an additional component that property should be used with a social utility in mind? That means that selfish notions of private property could not be hoarded, but had to be used in a way that benefited society. So I wanted to get to this question of property because this theme is so prominent in some of the letters between Jefferson and Madison, right? Or at least in one in particular. So when you're talking about government doing things to promote or somehow create an environment in which people have economic opportunity, you necessarily touch on property and property rights. So I guess Jeff wants to know what's the difference in the progressive understanding of property rights and say Jefferson and Madison's understanding of property rights. Are they similar or different? And if so, in what ways?
I think, again, it might be hard to generalize about all progressives, but I'll maybe make it sort of a general statement. And then if anyone wants to push back, they can. To me, a lot of it seems to be the starting point from which you begin talking about the regulation of property in civil society. I mean, even the Jefferson piece, we often look at that piece and he's talking about the unequal distribution of property. He says, one way you could think about this is something like a progressive income tax and breaking down primogeniture and all of these things. But the starting point is always that there is a natural right to property, rooted in the nature of things, rooted in human nature. Whereas for many progressives, I think the starting point is in the opposite direction, that there really is no natural right to property. And so what property rights are conventional determinations made in civil society, much very similar to what we talked about, the Wilsonian notion of rights being accorded by government. If you think about those two starting points, you get, in some ways, maybe you come to different places. I think the burden of proof in the Jeffersonian notion, and indeed the Lockean notion, would be for civil society to be able to justify why one could get between one's hand and his mouth, right? They'll use the sort of the Lincolnian notion that you eat the bread that you earn by the sweat of your own brow. Even Locke would suggest that there's a certain price to be paid for being a member of civil society. You can have taxation, civil societies are regulated, and you agree to be part of that. I think the Jeffersonian tradition really leans on that. The progressive tradition, by starting in another direction, the best example of this is in the New Nationalism speech. Teddy Roosevelt says, "We grudge no man a fortune, right, as long as it's honorably obtained." And he says, it's not even enough that it's honorably obtained. It must do active good to the community. If we deem as a civil society you're holding a private property does not benefit everyone, we'll take it away from you. And he says, I know that means far more redistribution than most of you are comfortable with. We're in a situation where we just have to say it out loud. And so I think there's a real difference there in the starting points. Now, I personally am someone who thinks that the progressives, and probably a lot of people who attack the progressives, turned the founding generation into something far more of civil libertarians than I think they were, especially with regard to property rights. I think they're reacting to the Lochner era court. They're reacting to really judges more than the founding. And I wonder sometimes if they don't rob from the founders a good deal of prudence in dealing with property rights in a way that would have to be consistent with the common good. They turn them all into a caricature of robber barons or something. And I just don't quite get that. And I think their fight really is sometimes with the court. And they often throw the baby out with the bathwater. So the problem becomes property rights rooted in nature are bad. Let's talk about the social good, where it might be something much more nuanced than that to say, yes, there's a natural right to property, but in civil society, those things have to be tweaked and negotiated in light of the common good. So that's a long-winded answer, but that's how I'd start that conversation.
I would say, here's a point, I guess, where Jason and I disagree. I think, in fact, Jefferson, it's not clear to me that Jefferson believed there was a natural right to property. And I think this letter, you can see some of that in this letter. When he says the earth was given as a common stock for man to labor and live on. If for the encouragement of industry, we allow it to be appropriated, we must take care that other employment be furnished to those excluded from the appropriation. I mean, I wouldn't, on that statement alone, rest the claim that Jefferson didn't believe there was a natural right in property. But I think there are other things you could point to in his writings, and I would say most of these are in letters, not in public statements.
Yeah.
But he did believe that in this notion of a common stock, and that that land. Well, let me take a step back.
Sure.
Previous to that statement in the letter, he says, whenever there is in any country uncultivated lands and unemployed poor, it is clear that the laws of property have been so far extended as to violate natural right. So if he did believe there's a natural right to property, he also believed that there was a kind of communal right to the opportunity to prosper and earn your living, and any arrangements that were made that prohibited the mass of people from that opportunity were wrong, and they violated natural rights. So at least at a minimum, there are competing natural rights here connected to property.
Yeah, I mean, there are some people, and again, we might debate this, but there's some people who just read this passage that you're quoting just as a restatement of Locke's natural law limitations on acquisition, even in the state of nature. So even in Locke, Mr. Natural Right to Property, there is a natural moral claim against acquiring more than one needs, taking so much that it spoils, right, and not leaving enough as good in common for others. And so if those things are a matter of natural right, that could happen in civil society as well. So there might be some even natural right ground, or maybe a natural law ground, to speak more properly, to putting moral limitations or duties that are inseparable from the right. And I think that's part of what maybe progressives go wrong, is associating the notion of natural rights merely with negative claims that have no corresponding duties that go with them. They turn it into a rapacious individualism that I don't even think is there in Locke. It's a perversion of Locke, at least in my opinion. So I think maybe we might be closer than we think. It's just a matter of navigating how we understand these natural claims in civil society.
Yeah, and again, if we remember that when Jefferson's speaking about land, I think it's generally the case for him that land is the means of production. Yeah. To put this in, what we might later 19th century, Marxist terms, land is the means of production. And he does seem to be saying in the letter that it is a legitimate object of governmental action to make sure the means of production are not monopolized. Yeah. And again, he's talking about land, but you could see how easily that could be translated into, well, actually, I don't think it's simply easy to translate it into an industrialized economy, because that economy is much more complex than what Jefferson was thinking about here. But there is a way in which he is talking, when he talks about land, he is talking about means of production. And he is, I think, saying that the government, it is a proper subject or object of political action and legislation to see that those means are not monopolized, so that others can't have the opportunity to make a life for themselves.
I think that's fair.
I think you're addressing a question or a comment with questions from Stacy. So just for clarification, Stacy writes, I think Jefferson's ideas concerning land ownership to reduce class barriers would seem quite dangerously socialistic to progressives, which lived in an era of real and practical application of that idea, to overthrow governments and establish socialist states. Would you see the extension of federal administration or ownership of open lands as a clear rejection of Jefferson's ideas, since it would remove the ability of the people to gain socioeconomic advancement in land ownership? That's a carefully worded question and kind of complex.
I would say if the federal government controlled land, and in doing so made it impossible for people to thrive economically, that he would consider that to be wrong. But I don't think he would necessarily say if a rancher near federal land was not allowed to use that land for some reason having to do with conservation, for example, that by itself established that there was a violation of natural rights there. But yeah, I think that it's one thing that's striking in the letter is that Jefferson tries to talk about this problem in a way that minimizes the government's role in solving it, so to speak. He says, change the laws of inheritance and they'll work silently. In other words, try to do things so that people's self-interest and natural interest in their children, for example, will lead to a distribution of property. Don't have the government seize the property and hand it out to people. That's the last thing Jefferson would want. And I'm not saying the progressives argued for that, but in other words, there is this notion of a progressive tax. That's true. But Jefferson was not a fan of taxes, and he tries to think of ways to do this with the least possible government involvement, precisely because the whole purpose of the exercise is to establish the conditions for independence and free action by Republican citizens. So you don't want the government, mandating these things or doing these things in a heavy-handed way that actually restricts people's freedom ultimately.
I think I'll just add, I think in this maybe is a roundabout way of getting to the question, but I think in Jefferson's way of thinking, there is a theoretical moral limiting principle based in natural rights and based in natural equality. Certain things are inalienable, that it's hard to sort of wrench a full-throated socialism out of that because there's necessarily a limiting principle on it. However, turn to a young academic Woodrow Wilson in one of his moments of intellectual honesty, his piece on socialism, which I know in the MAG program, some people, I think, Chris, you might even assign this piece as well, where he says, if you really think through the democratic principle and the notion of majority rule, socialism is just the logical outcome of democracy, because it's once you realize there is no limiting principle of what the people can do to serve their own common good. And that is the consequence, I think, of thinking about majority rule detached from and independent from any notion of natural rights. Absent a notion of natural rights, there is no theoretical limiting principle in democracy. And why not argue for a full-throated redistributionism or whatever it happens to be? Because why not? So I think that's something that might distinguish it. But again, trying to tease all this out of Jefferson and what would Jefferson say on this, now Jefferson's hard to nail down because David's exactly right. So much of what we see is we're teasing things out of his letters. I mean, even on the progressive tax, he says, well, one way you could do it is a progressive tax. He doesn't say, I hereby declare we should have progressive taxes. He says, like any of us would, well, here's one thing you could do. There's something else you could do. And so it's hard to make these comparisons sometimes.
Very thoughtful.
But I did. Sorry, Chris. I just wanted to say, I thought Jason, the last point Jason made was very important, and it shows. You could say, well, there's this theoretical disagreement about rights and whether they're natural and so forth. But Jason just pointed to a very practical consequence of that argument. And so I just wanted to emphasize, I thought that was very good that Jason did that. It's a good point.
Yeah, that was a great point. Shifting gears here a little bit, a question from Timothy. Would you say that TR was more of a moderate progressive compared to Wilson? TR seems to appreciate history, especially Lincoln, more than Wilson, while at the same time advocating the need for change. And immediately I think of the New Nationalism speech where Roosevelt invokes our history, at least, back to the Civil War, and really uses that language, takes advantage of that, of this opportunity to speak about the need for change and progress, but framed in the context of the sort of course of U.S., even the purpose, if you will, of U.S. history. So is there a difference? What's the difference between, say, a Theodore Roosevelt and a Wilson? And how do their views of history inform that difference, perhaps?
That's a lot. That's a lot to take on.
It is a lot, yeah.
Yeah, I'll just maybe comment. I might have to ease my way into it and kind of work into it to think about it. Just a couple things I'll say just to get us started on that. I mean, I think that, of course, TR is a voluminous writer, TR an academic and historian in his own right, but not in the sense of Woodrow Wilson, the political scientist, right? And so there's I've always found at least a real practicality to some of TR's rhetoric that I think shines through. And in terms of some folks would say he's more moderate. I really think what you have is, depending on where and when TR is standing, you get the more or less radicalized version of TR. I think if you look at TR early in his presidency, he says, I'm duty bound by the way I assume the office to sort of follow McKinley's policies. Once he's elected in his own right, he begins a much more open sort of agenda of progressive legislation. I think by the time you get to the new nationalism, you see the way that is rolling. By 1912, he knows where his political bread is buttered, and he snuggles up to a lot more proposals for direct democracy, initiative, referendum, recall of judicial decisions. At the time, that's pretty radical stuff. In fact, the recall of judicial decisions was so, for Taft, was so immoderate that that's part of the big falling out between TR and Taft, as he saw TR taking on what he thought were not moderate positions at all. And so I think TR is a bit of a moving target. I think, and sometimes, I'm not saying he doesn't believe what he says, I think sometimes he does, but I think the electoral situation on the ground sometimes encourages TR to become a bit more radical as he moves through, especially after 1910. And that's just the beginning of an answer. That's a really good question. There's a lot going on there.
Well, maybe as a follow-up, there's a question from Shaylin. He wants to know what the motivating factors were for both Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson to move, as he puts it, so far away from founding principles, and even in Wilson's case, to dismiss their philosophies as irrelevant in the 20th century.
David, do you want to speak to that one, or I can follow up? I don't know. There's, again, a lot to think about.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I guess I would say there are two things. One is, and I think we may not emphasize this enough, or not have it maybe foremost in our minds enough, but the United States did go through a remarkable change through industrialization. And that by itself would have caused people to it should have, I think, caused people to rethink things. And then there was a long, the Merriam piece is really good because it shows that there was a long period, a long development of this rethinking of American principles. And in fact, I think you could go so far as to say that those principles were never had the authority, you might say, that we wished they had, because it's clear, Calhoun gets mentioned, not his defense of slavery, but his view of things, gradual development of historical, gradual development of political institutions, this focus on the family, and you could see all of those things in Wilson's textbook on government. I don't know, I don't recall that he cites Calhoun the way Merriam does, but he's really giving the same account. So the founding, it's not, I mean, the founding principles, I think, were always controversial. Once you get past the first couple of decades, and the slavery obviously made them controversial, more and more controversial, and there was a lot of it. To me, what it shows is the uniqueness, and this gets back to partly the argument between Madison and Jefferson. But I think Madison is right, although he may not have had this in mind. But there was a uniqueness to that, to 1776, just to use that particular date. I would say we were fortunate that those people came together at that moment with that understanding of human history and politics. It's a decidedly minority view, and it's not even clear to me in the history of the United States that it ever was a majority view among the, quote, learned, unquote. I don't know if that's
a tough question. But and by the way, Wilson acknowledges everything that you just said about the founding. It was a fortunate and necessary moment in our history because it did lay the foundation for things. But I guess the short answer is, or one short answer that of course invites a longer answer to Shaylin's point is, and you've mentioned it before, circumstances change. So they were espousing those principles at a time in which the environment, political, economic, social, that they lived in, those principles seemed, at least to the intellectual leaders of the revolution, to make perfect sense. But you have a civil war that comes along. David, you mentioned the disagreements over slavery. The Civil War seems to settle that question, but it opens up a whole host of new problems that Americans had not faced. Whether you're a farmer struggling to, pay railroad rates to ship your goods to far off places that you've never had to do, the problems that come with industrialization and urbanization. I mean, everything from unsafe working conditions as a result of these massive industries to, STDs, drug use, gangs. When circumstances change so much, our social and economic circumstances change so much, I think it's only natural that a question arises, a real tension arises in the sense that the question is, to what extent, as much as we want to preserve those principles, to what extent can we, in light of the fact that things have changed?
Yeah, that's an important question, right? That are the progressives right to suggest that some of these old ideas are insufficient to meet the challenges of the day? I mean, there seems to me to be a real assertion there that they're either incomplete, insufficient, need to be, and sometimes just tweaked, or other times outright thrown out. And so I'm always curious: is the founding so I don't know what the word would be, but is it so susceptible to this argument that it's no longer sufficient?
And again, just taking Wilson for example, Wilson's, I think, rhetorical approach as a solution is to say, well, of course we agree with the founders. Liberty is important. Equality is important, but what those things mean in their content changes in light of changing circumstances. So again, we're aware of that tension.
I think we also should remember that both Jefferson and Madison believed that this is particularly true, I think, of Jefferson, that the Republic, what he thought was at stake in the fight with Hamilton was a view of the Republic that was subject to very specific conditions, which meant lots of available land for his Republic dominated by farmers to thrive. And he knew that would come to an end. And he often, it's not just rhetorical when he says, when our people are crowded together in cities, our Republican government will come to an end. So they anticipated that the circumstances would change, the socioeconomic circumstances would change, and their prescriptions would not necessarily. I don't mean Jason, again, it's that point Jason brought up about the importance of rights, natural rights, and limit on majority rule and so forth. They didn't think that would change, but how that would be exercised or what institutional changes would be necessary or whatnot to deal with changed circumstances, they understood that would happen. So I guess I would say, even from their perspective, they would not have been surprised at the progressive movement or the populist movement. They may have disagreed with its fundamental principles or with particular policy proposals, but I think they would have said that's inevitable, unavoidable. And in fact, if we tried to avoid it, we would destroy the Republic anyway.
Maybe the question is, how, using Jefferson's analogy, the coat, the little boy's coat, which I always found interesting. How much can it stretch, right, as the boy grows? So the principles of the founding, as the fabric of the coat, are they flexible enough? Anyway.
Yeah.
With that a lot. Go ahead, Jason. You wanted to jump in.
Well, I was going to say, we talked a lot about principles, and I don't want to rob a question from anyone else, but David's comments sort of made me think of a question, which is, we've talked a lot about first principles. We've talked a bit about policy or maybe economic competition, but another sort of leg to the chair or the table here is all of these profound institutional reforms. Direct election of senators, more initiative, referendum recall, easier method of constitutional amendments, direct primaries. I mean, just all sorts of things like that. And I always wonder, there we're talking about means in service of ends. And that's something when I teach the progressives, I kind of lay some of those proposals along something like Federalist 9 or 51 that lays out all of these institutions as being necessary for healthy Republican government. And there's a place where I wonder if we could compare the founders. But the founders have suggested that changed circumstances are so great in economics that we need to then fundamentally change political institutions, not just in terms of policy. I'm curious, David, if you have any thoughts on that, or Chris, or anyone that would want to chime in on that. That's something I kind of wrestle with and think about as I teach these things.
I'd rather hear you two think out loud.
Sure.
But I'll just say, I think when you ask that question, this is another place where you kind of have to make a distinction between the different progressives, because they had various suggestions for the kinds of institutional reforms that we wanted. So the kinds of things you were mentioning, Jason, I tend to think of Theodore Roosevelt and the supporters of the Progressive Party platform in 1912, with its emphasis, at least on the surface anyway, for increased democracy and participatory democracy. Whereas the Woodrow Wilson type progressive, on the other hand, didn't warm much to those types of democratic institutional changes, and seemed to lean much more heavily and openly on the need for increased regulatory powers on the part of the national government, right? In fact, Woodrow Wilson was not a supporter of he did not like many of those democratic changes to our political institutions, and preferred keeping them to a minimum. In fact, I think of all of the long lists that Roosevelt lays out in his speeches and that are included in the Progressive Party platform in 1912 for democratic reforms, the only one Wilson really agrees with is the short ballot, which actually minimizes right the number of choices that voters have to make in each election. But how about the presidency? I mean, somebody brought up earlier the effect of progressives on the role of the presidency in our constitutional system. That to me is a big institutional change in how we think about the president, what we expect from the president. In many ways, he becomes the most important branch, or she, maybe someday. But the president becomes the branch of the executive branch becomes the branch that everybody expects to do the important things, right, to get things done. So, how did progressives think about that?
David, do you want to speak to that first, or?
Well, only to say I think that's an obvious difference, and it's connected to some of the things we've been saying in terms of, connected to some of the principles we've been talking about. But there's also the question: would the presidency have achieved the scope of power it has now if there hadn't been the Depression, World War II, immediately followed by the Cold War? So there's a practical, you could say, historical consideration. Many of the powers that the president has now are things explicitly granted to the president by Congress to deal with emergency situations that supposedly, I say supposedly because, I mean, it's not always clear that this is true, but supposedly created by modern circumstances. So the limited conception of the presidency domestically, I mean, in terms of foreign policy, Jefferson had as expansive understanding of the powers of the president as you could imagine. But domestically, a lot of that seems to have come about through a series of crises, again, interpreted through the principles that the progressives articulated. But still, it's not clear to me how much of it would have come about if those circumstances had been different. I don't know if that makes sense. But
I'd just say that here's where Wilson and TR, but Wilson looms large. I mean, if you read Wilson's writing on some of the presidency in terms of what it could become and what the potential was there for, I mean, just to sort of second what Chris had said, that this notion of executive leadership, the notion that the president has sort of a unique moral rhetorical mandate to represent the soul of the nation, when we expect so much from presidents to be moral rhetorical educators, that's very much a consequence of the progressive era. Wilson looked, I mean, if you recall, Wilson, that writing on the presidency came during and after TR's presidency. He says, I looked at TR and I realized how big this office could be. It can be as big as the man who holds it. We would say today, of course, man or woman. And the argument has long legs. I mean, we still talk about it all the time. And I think David's right. It's in hindsight, after all of these circumstances that allow the presidency to become what Wilson thought it could be. But one point I would always bring up in thinking about this is, for Wilson, the real limits of executive authority and what defines executive authority is public opinion. And I think for Hamilton and others at the founding, the real structuring of presidential power was in the Constitution itself. And so I think there's a way for Wilson to go around constitutional limitations by appealing to the people directly. And that's the importance of opinion leadership and shaping public opinion. I know that for the founding, they were uncomfortable. Their selection system speaks to it. They were uncomfortable with the problem of direct appeals to the people by presidents. It smacked of demagoguery. And I would argue that demagoguery now is part of the DNA, or maybe not the DNA, but the new code for the presidency. And we see it on both sides of the ball. That's not a partisan statement at all. Presidents all have their special form of demagoguery these days. And Wilson, I think, to his credit, tried to draw a distinction, say, I'm not talking about demagogues. I'm supporting the notion of responsible progressive opinion leadership. But that I think is a hard line to walk. So I'll just say that.
We have a number of, I'm sorry, David, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You're going to go to questions. Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I was going to raise, there are three questions in particular that seem connected to each other. They have to do with, in light of the conversation you've both been having here, the things you've been saying, and have to do with, again, the role that the people, the citizens, I should say, play in society as opposed to the expectations of the president or the government in general. So I'm trying to find these questions. See if I can find where they start. Sorry. Like Christopher, for example, says, I'm thinking of how I'd like to discuss how to discuss this with my 7th and 8th grade students. Is it fair to make the comparison that the heavy lifting of moral action and creation of opportunity is the responsibility of individuals and citizens, according to the founders, whereas it is the responsibility of government, according to progressives and 20th century thinkers? And then Nadia, I think, raises a similar kind of question about the role of education in producing certain kinds of citizens with a kind of common wisdom to manage change on their own. And so I'm asking this in light of this conversation that we're having now about the institutional changes that progressives are calling for. Do the kinds of institutional changes they want have a sort of maybe detrimental is not the right word, but an effect on the role that citizens themselves are supposed to play in solving problems, coming up with solutions to things, political influence and things like this? I hope there was a question in there somewhere.
Yeah, I'm thinking through. There's a few things, a few angles to go at there. So let me see if I get the question straight. That do the sort of institutional changes that the progressives, many of whom the progressives would have advocated, do they have a detrimental or frustrating effect on active sort of
let's call it democracy,
citizen virtue,
democratic citizenship?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing that springs to mind, and this is just totally off the cuff, but the first thing that springs to mind is Tocqueville, right? Writing in a little bit different era, but wondering about the tendency of democracy to look to the general government and to general ideas and sort of shorthand versions of how to fix problems, and in many ways looking at the federal government to solve what formerly would have been problems as townships, states, localities, private institutions, and in doing so, sometimes forgetting what self-government means, a kind of active citizen liberty at the local level. Tocqueville predicts that in the 1830s, that America is prone to that. So it's not just something unique to progressivism. There's something about, I would say, maybe the extended republic and a national government, the kind of national government it takes in an extended republic, and something about the habits that democracy and, frankly, economic prosperity, relatively speaking, might provide, that lends itself to a kind of citizens' abdication of their responsibilities. That's just the beginning of an answer, but I think Tocqueville was thinking about this even before the progressive era, and it could be the case that some of these reforms and sort of, what could we say, national democratizing reforms might have a kind of dark edge to them.
Well,
okay.
I would just add quickly, insofar as the reforms undermined the parties, which I think they did, to that extent, they have in a way limited citizens' ability to function democratically. I guess I would say that.
Okay, great. Just checking the questions that have come in here. If you'll permit me, we have about 10 minutes left. Can we talk a little bit about foreign policy differences, perhaps, between the founders and the progressives? Somebody submitted a question about progressives and imperialism. and perhaps they noticed some things in the Charles Marion piece. If I remember correctly, he mentions the changes in how progressives think about the role of the United States in the world. So where does this imperialism, as it's called, come from in the progressive mind? What is it about the progressive mind that opens the door for, again, what many people call imperialism?
Some thoughts, but I'll absolutely defer to David on foreign policy for sure. Kick it off.
I wonder here whether there's if I think of Jefferson, for example, or I think of the founders generally, a lot of what we think of as their, you could say they're isolationist, if you will. I think that's the wrong term maybe, but isolationist foreign policy has to do with their appreciation of the balance of power in the world at the time they lived. That is to say, the United States had virtually none. Therefore, what it could do was very limited. By the time the progressives, by the latter 19th century, the United States is a world power. And with that power comes certain responsibilities. So I think it's very hard to talk about, if Jefferson had been alive, if Jefferson's lifespan had coincided with Woodrow Wilson's, I don't know that Jefferson would have acted differently, to be honest. He very much believed, and he talked very expansively about the spread of democracy. He always wanted that to happen peacefully, but I think he would have been happy to see the United States side with the Cubans against the Spanish Empire, the remnants of it anyway, those sorts of things. Whether in the particular instance he would have advocated the use of force or not, I think that's hard to calculate. I mean, how would he have understood those circumstances? But there's another part of it I think we haven't really mentioned at all, and that's the role of Christianity in progressivism. And I do think that Christianity, our imperialism coincides with an expansion of American Christian missionary activity, and I think they're correlated, just as it was in the case of Great Britain. There's a way in which Christianity is a progressive religion. It aims towards this coming, the second coming of Christ and so forth. It's expansive. It's evangelical. It wants to reach out, make converts. There's lots of ways in which I think our, you could say progressive foreign policy is an expression of Christian sentiments and preferences. I don't think that's entirely fair, because there were Christians who were bitterly critical of what we did in the Philippines, for example. So I don't mean to, say that all Christians, cheered on what we did in the Philippines or any other particular case, but there's a way in which there's a kind of expansiveness to our foreign policy that's, one, driven by the increase in our power, but two, I think also influenced by a kind of Christian evangelical sentiment about changing the world, converting souls to democracy, kind of secular version of the Christian effort.
Yeah, that language of being saved and language of redemption, some of the most powerful defenses of American expansionism into the Philippines and then perhaps Cuba at one point, but Latin America in general they use that, they invoke that language of Christianity very clearly. I think it's a great point, David. Even going so far back as to invoke Cain and Abel, right, and being one's brother's keeper and these sorts of things. So yeah, that's really interesting. Sorry, Jason.
No, it's great. All is great. I'll just add one thing in terms of Christianity. I do think there's a secularized version of that too that is in many ways influenced by, again, a philosophy of history. The notion is sort of oftentimes it's Hegelianism. It has that same sort of seemingly providential character, but it's a secularized version. Christianity and Hegelianism go hand in hand very well, obviously, if you've read any Hegel. In fact, Christianity is a big part of that progress that we were talking about. The other thing, though, that we haven't said too much about is just the notion of social Darwinism. That I know for a lot of teachers, textbooks are always associating that somehow with robber barons or something like that. But there's a very healthy dose of reform Darwinism and progressivism, and it's often applied to the foreign policy realm. That's what makes sense of Merriam Miriam's talking about John Burgess's social Darwinism and the notion that the Teutonic races are a little further along on the development of history than some other races, and they have a paternal duty to shepherd others towards that progress when they happen to get on the train to progress. And so there's a very easy kinship between some of our actions in various parts of the world, especially in the Philippines, perhaps in Cuba. This foreign policy that I've seen a lot of teachers in teaching in the MAG program really have a hard time understanding. How can progressivism at the same time seemingly support what seems to be this sort of racist policy? And I often argue that there's something embedded in the ideas that makes that jump not too hard. In fact, I would say, and this is me speaking, I won't attribute this to anyone else on our panel here, but to the extent that you jettison the notion of natural rights, it becomes a lot easier to make some of these colonization arguments. That's not to say that you couldn't make the same argument by contradicting yourself or whatever it happens to be, but natural rights are in some ways perhaps the beginnings of an argument against that notion of colonization.
Yeah, progressives often, that's great. And progressives frequently made a sort of moral imperative argument for imperialism, right? That is, it's a kind of, if it's racist, it's a kind of beneficent racism for the good of the peoples that are being civilized. So yeah, great stuff. We have 2 minutes left. I'll end with this question from Timothy. Pardon me. Wilson mentions that the founding generation was Newtonian in its approach to government and progressives more Darwinian. What model do you think we are trending toward today? And I'll let you answer that in any way you want it in the last 2-3 minutes.
David,
or say whatever you want to say in 2-3 minutes.
Yeah, in terms of, well, here, I think there is actually, I think, as I understand this, and I don't understand it very well or necessarily comprehensively, I mean, not at all comprehensively, but there are a lot of people raising questions about whether the Darwinian, I mean, the evolutionary way of thinking is actually an adequate explanation for an understanding of biology, right? And if that's true, that's interesting. I mean, and these are very, very controversial claims to make. And if you raise this claim, you're sometimes, castigated as a, anti-science sort of person or something. But if that begins to change, and nobody knows exactly what will replace it, but if that begins to change, it'll be interesting to see if it changes the way we think about politics. And just quickly, I'll mention one other thing. I think there's a way in which the progressivism is attached to industrialization and the problems of industrialization. And if we are in a post-industrial society, one in which information and the manipulation of information, rather than bashing metal, is more important. I think that's what we're struggling with right now. And so it's not clear to me that the progressives can answer the kinds of questions that are beginning to emerge, which may in fact lead to a less centralized form of administration as the best way to, not only best politically, but even the best way economically to organize ourselves.
That's really interesting.
I have a far less eloquent response to the Darwinian Newtonian thing. I'll just tell very quickly, I was once teaching that passage to a student of mine years ago, and he was really very honestly struggling with it, trying to think through, what is Wilson saying here, this Newtonian Darwinian metaphor? And he says, let me see if I can recapitulate it. He says, the founders believed in gravity, but we now know men came from monkeys. Therefore, I don't have to believe in separation of powers. So we all laughed, and he was being serious.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Only half joking, but there's actually a very serious point to that, which is the metaphor itself doesn't quite really hold up. And the use of Darwin, I've actually written a conference paper on this recently, that the use of Darwin in much progressive political rhetoric is merely rhetorical and metaphorical, right? To talk about change, organic change, et cetera. It's hard, and it becomes a bit of a stretch. I think looking for more serious pieces on how Darwin is relevant to progressive thinking is Dewey's famous piece, The Influence of Darwin on Philosophy, which I think is a much more rigorous notion of what Darwinism would really mean. And that's the idea that there is a universe out there that's in flux and a human being that's in flux. and there's consequences for how we think about truth and rights and justice and all sorts of important ideas. So the Wilson piece I always bristle a little bit at, because I think he's playing around a little bit with some just rhetoric that we now repeat. But I do think there are some more serious pieces out there that really do speak to the importance of Darwin on progressive political thought. Yeah.
Well, thank you both very much. This has been a very thoughtful and pleasant conversation, and really appreciate your time and your thoughts on this. So it's a tough question, and I think hopefully a lot of us have come away from this with a little bit clearer sense of how to think about these things and the consequences of this question. So again, I very much appreciate your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
And thanks to everybody who submitted questions. We had some great questions, and we tried to get to as many as possible. Just remind you once again about the email that you will receive with your link for a certificate of participation. If you have enjoyed our conversation today, this webinar, please look into the many other resources that Ashbrook provides through our website, teachingamericanhistory.org. And please help us spread the word about these webinars and our other programs by sharing the archived link, which you'll receive, again, by email to your colleagues and on social media. So our next webinar will be Saturday, December 5th, and we will consider the question, did the New Deal end the Great Depression? So I'm looking forward to another fun and lively conversation on that question. Until then, take care, and thank you very much for joining.
Thanks again for listening. You can learn more about our free resources for teachers and students at teachingamericanhistory.org or TAH.org.